John. How are
I'm,
you?
we're okay. Thank you very much. It's very nice of you to ask. Is this Shay Peters?
It is Shea Peters. Actually, it's a faux Shea Peters. In your honor, I have a Georgian library backdrop because it reminds me of Dublin.
Oh, okay. So I thought I was really impressed. I thought, my God, there's money in book selling. I'm in the wrong business. Look at that.
You know,
Okay. I
it's a
can
lot
only
of
dream of what lies behind it.
it's a lot of fun. The local art museum here, the Phoenix Art Museum, has a collection of miniature rooms called the Thorn Rooms, which it's like Queen Mary's dollhouse, except
Okay.
on a way bigger scale. And so they have allowed us to download some of them. So in reality, behind me is this ugly green piece of cloth, but it looks very elegant, doesn't it?
No, it looks very, it's you. It's you. A lot of people couldn't carry it off, but that kind of royalty you can do.
You're so kind. So this takes me back to something I wanted to chat with you about because we're actually going to be talking about The Dirty South, your new Charlie Parker book, on October 19th, if I
Sure.
remember the date
We
right.
are indeed.
So my first trip to Ireland, which was in, I think, 2006 or 2005, you had been at the Poison Pen in the fall preceding it while we were thinking about it. And do you remember you said to me that if I were going, you would plan our trip?
I do remember planning the trip. I thought that there might be, if the book thing didn't work out, I thought maybe I could set up a small boutique travel agency for the more discerning traveler. So you were my first test. You were my test case. Did it work?
You
Were you
know,
happy?
it absolutely worked. And I will tell you that on the flight over to Shannon, my husband, who obviously knows you well, like I do, because you've been here so many times, said to me somewhat dubiously, "Are you sure that John really knows the kind of trip you're expecting?" And I said, "Well, we'll see." And then as we drove into the gates of Ashford Castle, Rob looked over at me and he said, "John has your number." It's going to be perfect.
That was like Ashford Castle was the first place that I took my partner to stay when she came over first. When I was trying to impress her, I thought, but I think I might have set the bar unreasonably high from that point onwards because really it was downhill from there. But Ashford's lovely, and funny, it seems to be doing okay, although there aren't obviously as many tourists as there were. It has reopened, and we had thought about going there, but we'd have to sell one of the children, but it would probably be worth it.
Well, I will say that Ashford Castle, the first thing I loved about Ashford Castle is that its motto is excellence since 1228, which is really hard to beat. And the Guinness family, the Brewer family, owned it for a while. It isn't a private lake, but it's on, I never can pronounce the Irish, John. Tell me what it's called.
The what?
The Loch. Loch Corrib, is that
Oh,
what
it's
it's
Loch Corrib, yes. That's quite
called?
well done. Yeah, Loch Corrib.
Right. So it's a
Good.
beautiful lake, and the castle is lakeside properties, and then there's a little river that runs through the property that you can walk down past an old abbey fishing.
An old abbey, yes, that's part of Cong village and Cong and that area where was where the cast of The Quiet Man stayed. I suppose that's Ashford Castle's big claim to fame is that when John Ford was filming The Quiet Man, he stayed there, I think, and John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara stayed in the hotel. And I think a lot of the rest of the crew probably had to make do with the bed and breakfast in Cong, but into every life a little rain must fall. So I quite liked the fact that I was staying in a place where John Wayne had worked. I have a fondness for The Quiet Man. I think it's quite a lovely film. Some of the attitudes towards women don't really stand up in this day and age, but maybe we'll have to skate slightly over them and just look at the better points.
How very true that they don't hold up. But I have to say that The Quiet Man was my mother's favorite movie for most of her life. She absolutely loved it. But the village of Cong, which is perfectly charming, has a lovely little bookshop. And on our last visit a year ago in May, my husband and I walked up into the village and naturally were drawn to the bookshop. And who should I spy in the bookshop but a large row of John Connolly books? And the bookseller told me that
I like to think I've left a little bit of money in Cong Village over the years. So the least that I could do is to provide a shelf for my books. That's nice to know.
it was lovely. I took photographs of you there in Cong on the shelf, which I like. So the other thing I like about Ashford Castle is it has a resident wolfhound. and they bring him out every morning for morning coffee, like I think from 10 to 11. And there are statues of him on either side of the doorway, but the dog himself is, I think, larger than the statues. Did you have a chance to see him?
We did, and actually we took my son's fiance's parents to Ashford last year. We stayed in the lodge with them. What I like about Ashford is, despite the fact that it's this 5-star, very expensive hotel, you can bring your dogs to stay there. You know, you can bring your pet dog to stay. And as long as it's not in the dining room, it can sit in the bar, it can sit in the public areas. So we took both our dogs to the lodge, and they were well looked after. The other thing is, the chef cooks your dog a special meal. So you can order dog meals from Ashford Castle. So we thought, for the fun of it, we would order this. The dog's food was better than ours. I mean, essentially, they were cooking them salmon and mashed potatoes and things. And I thought, why are we paying money in the bar for this? We should just order the dog's food, say it's for the dogs, give the dogs their tins of food, and we'll have the dog food. It was extraordinary. But I love that. I love that informality of it, that despite the fact that it is this very lavish place, you never feel like there are people standing at attention around you, or that, you know, you have to mind your P's and Q's. There's a very relaxed atmosphere to it.
There really is.
I really recommend it. If you have like $2,000 burning a hole in your pocket, I can recommend Ashford Castle.
Well, I have to say that the grounds are beautiful. They also have a resident falconer, and you can fly the birds. I think there's a golf course. You can certainly fish, because in the River Cong, because there were people and waiters. So altogether, it's an Irish country house experience, and it's on the west coast of Ireland. Now, John, there's a whole trail now that goes up the west coast of Ireland. It's kind of like the Whiskey Trail in Scotland, or the Amalfi Drive in Italy or something. And it's really lovely. Where does it start? In Galway?
I think a lot of it starts actually slightly further south. I think the Burren perhaps forms part of that as well, which is in County Clare. We've divided up the country in an effort to encourage tourists before all this unfortunateness began. We had divided up the country into various segments to encourage people to drive, because people tended to go to the same old places, and we wanted them to see a little bit of the scenery. So I think there's one section of it's called Ireland's Ancient East, which, given how modern Dublin is, seems to be pushing it slightly. But nevertheless, if it works and it brings people, that's fine. But yeah, there are parts of Ireland that are simply not often very explored. It's funny you should mention the falconry. I took one of your customers of your store there, Joe Long, who lives in New York and buys a lot of books from Poison Pen. And it is my favorite Ashford Castle story. So I took Joe to Ashford as a treat, because we've been friends for a very long time. And I said to him, what would you like to do? Would you like to maybe go play pigeon shooting or archery, or we can go to the School of Falconry? And Joe said, the School of Falconry. He will hate me for telling the story, by the way, but never mind. And he said, okay, the School of Falconry. So I took him, we booked a slot, and the two of us went off. And they presented him with this huge barn owl, and then they said, well, now we will take a falcon out, because you're given your own falcon to go out with. And Joe said, look, he said, I'm from Hell's Kitchen. He said, I don't have any truck with falcons. I'm a bit unsure about all of this. You know, he didn't grow up with birds of prey sitting on his arm. And the guy said, listen, you're absolutely fine. Don't worry about it. And Joe said, they've never attacked a person, have they? And the guy said, no, God, no. He said, don't be silly. So we went for a walk in the woods, and Joe he had his falcon, and every so often it would fly into the trees, and then you summon it down with a piece of meat, and it would land on his arm. And I was chatting away with the guide, and the next minute, and you might have to block out some language here. But the next minute there was this shout from the forest, and a melon farmer, I'll use as the polite term for what was said. And we turned around, and a falcon had attached itself to Joe Long's hat and was attempting to steal it. And he was waving his hand at us. This falcon dug its claws into his head. And the guy with me, he turned to me and he said, you know, they hardly ever do that. And I thought, and Joe Long was convinced that we had set him up, that we had somehow managed to train a falcon in the space of a day to attack a man in a New York hat. And when we went to dinner that evening, we see the staff talking. And eventually one of them was nominated to come over to our table and was pouring water. And he leaned into Joe and he said, you wouldn't be the gentleman that was attacked by the falcon, would you? And he became a legend in that one moment. So the Poison Pen has given something back to Ashford Castle, I like to think.
I love it. That is so great. And you know, there's a little steamer service that goes around Loch Corrib, and one of the docks, they have their own dock at Ashford Castle. So you can really do a beautiful interior water tour. But let's talk about Galway for a minute, because we think Galway, we really have to think Ken Bruin, right? I mean, you
Sure.
know, the master noirist from Galway. I've been there before, but when we were there last May, it felt a year ago, May. Right.
Mhm.
It felt a little bit different, and I'm not entirely sure why. But on the main square, there were some amazing pubs. And we went and had lunch in one up on the second story, and it was incredibly Edwardian, this beautiful woodwork. Do you know which pub I'm talking about?
No, I mean, there's no shortage of nice pubs in Galway. The city, I mean, it's a city that's becoming increasingly modernized and touristed. I think it's very much dependent upon it now. And because of what's happened, the coronavirus, the city is really struggling. I think it was due to be the city of culture this year, and that all fell by the wayside, which is deeply unfortunate. And things like the Galway races were held without a crowd, and really without any guests. So it has struggled a bit, Galway. I'm quite fond of Galway, although it's often said in Ireland that Galway is where ambition goes to die, because you'll go into a pub and you'll be surrounded by guys they were going to be poets, they were going to be painters, they were going to be novelists, and somehow they ended up in a pub in Galway instead, and it never quite happened to them. So I always think that maybe 2 nights in Galway was probably as much as I should spend there, or else I'll become one of those guys going, you know, I wrote some books once upon a time. I used to be somebody. So you have to be very careful about these things.
Well, Ireland's always been very supportive of authors, and I know that in Dublin, one of the times I was there, my daughter and I went to visit is it called the Irish Writers Museum? I'm not entirely sure I
It
remember
is.
the name.
Yeah, we now have a second one, which is opened in Newman House on St. Stephen's Green, which is a much more lavish, high-tech affair devoted to the history of Irish writing. The Irish Writers Museum was small and quite quaint, but I think it also had things like Handel's chair and stuff that maybe didn't quite belong in it. Whereas now we have in the old Newman House, which is Cardinal Newman's residence, which used to be part of University College Dublin, is now housing a quite lavish history of Irish literature. And we probably did need a proper Irish literature museum, given the history that we've had in the country. I haven't been in, actually, because it's a place I have yet to visit. I was going to go in before all of this happened. I'm curious to see how it handles genre, because I think we still have a problem in Ireland with genre fiction and how we relate to it. I think we sometimes like to pretend that it's something that you give to the servants. So I'd be interested to see what focus the museum might have on.
That will be interesting. I just got an advanced reading copy of John Banville's new mystery, which he
Snow,
writes. I'm trying to remember, what is the name he adopts?
Snow, Snow, and he's writing it as John Banville, but I think it's called Snow.
Snow, that's it, right. I just put it on the shelf, but you know, he did adopt a pseudonym to write his several crime novels. And that you know, people used to do that in Britain too, particularly people from Oxford who had numerous, you know,
Yeah,
academics who wrote genre fiction under hidden names.
the poet Cecil Day Lewis wrote genre fiction under a pseudonym, and I think Julian Barnes at one point might have written Dan something or other. He used a pseudonym as well. Yeah, John. I'm very fond of John. I find him very funny, but I think he certainly had some ambivalence about writing crime fiction. I remember one of my testier moments. I think I described him as acting like someone who'd been forced to take in laundry to make ends meet. That he had somehow been reduced to this. And yet I think what's really interesting is that genre fiction was very good for him in a way, because he used to say that he would write 200 words a day as John Banville and 2,000 words a day as Benjamin Black. But I think it made him realize actually that, you know, maybe that as you get older, that's maybe not the ideal way to write. Every writer, we live very short lives, and creative lives are shorter still. And all writers are going to die with unfinished books, with books unwritten, with ideas that they didn't bring to fruition. And I think it's interesting that after he began writing as Benjamin Black, his productivity increased considerably. He began producing a book a year. You know, sometimes, I mean, there were he's published 2 books this year, he will have, after Snow appears. he began writing faster because I think he realized actually maybe there is a trade-off here. You know, maybe I shouldn't be spending 5 years writing a book because, you know, I can write a book that's probably at least as good. In 2 years, there's a different impetus that comes with writing genre fiction. And I think it benefited him to a degree, although he's never really discussed it. So I'd be curious to hear what he thinks. It certainly changed the way in which he wrote.
That's really interesting. I also think there's always the problem too. If somebody wins something remarkable like the Booker Prize, which John Banville did, then there's a weight of expectation that that may have somewhat of an interesting effect. I remember Sarah Caldwell. Did you ever know Sarah?
No, I didn't.
Well, she wrote just a remarkable set of books about a group of London lawyers. They were, you know, amazing. And The Siren Sang a Murder is an absolute gem. But she won the Anthony Award for, I'd have to look up which title it was. And it just paralyzed her. And she really never wrote, I think she might possibly have written one more with Hillary, her androgynous sleuth. One of the things about that series was you never knew whether Hillary was male or female. And she worked very hard to keep, you know, maybe she was ahead of her time, but to keep her, I don't think she was necessarily, or he, binary, but just, you know, didn't come up. But anyway, and there are other authors, I think, when they have had a bestseller or won a prestigious prize, then there is a weight of expectation, both from the writer himself or herself inside, but also from publishers and fans that up the pressure. So maybe the point I was going to make is that maybe writing as Benjamin Black in crime fiction kind of reduced some of that pressure that as Banville might still have been on him.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think it's absolutely true. I mean, one of the books I've loved this year is Hilary Mantel's The Mirror and the Light, because I think that trilogy about Thomas Cromwell is one of the most extraordinary achievements of the last decade or so of English writing. And she won the Booker Prize for the first 2 volumes of that. And now it's up for the 3rd volume. And if it doesn't win it, there will be a sense almost that in a way it's been kind of a failure, you know, that and I think what's curious, it is a more flawed book than the 2 books that preceded it. I think it tries to fit an awful lot of the final part of Cromwell's life into rather too many pages. But I still think that I think certainly of the other books I've read this year, and none of them really compare with the level of ambition that book shows. And I would really love to see her win that prize. But I think you're right. I can't imagine the pressure of winning the Booker Prize 2 novels in a row and then producing the 3rd part of the trilogy and feeling, my God, you know, if I don't get nominated, if I don't win it, where does that leave me? You know, is this going to be the kind of poor relative of the trilogy, the red-headed stepchild of my great Thomas Cromwell work? So you're right, it's a huge amount of pressure. And some writers deal with it better than others, I think.
You know, that's an interesting point. It probably would have been better if she had not won it for the first one and then won it for 2 and 3.
The second one, it might have taken some of the pressure off her, I think. But, you know, what a lovely position to be in, going, you know, oh, well, you know, my 2 Booker Prizes, you know, maybe I'll win the 3rd and maybe I won't. But, yeah, what you going to do?
So let's go back to the West Coast, because another place that you sent us was this really fabulous geographical marvel called the Burren. I could hardly believe my eyes when we were in the Burren. And Cora Harrison, who's an Irish writer, wrote a number of medieval Irish mysteries set in the Burren, which I can well understand. If I remember right, John, there's a small ferry at some point an auto ferry that you have to cross somewhere in the Burren. So there was a time pressure. We had to arrive at the little drive on for the ferry or miss it, and then it would have been a very long detour, although I might be confusing that. But tell us a bit about the Burren, because it's truly amazing.
It's just this extraordinary landscape, it's a karst landscape. That aspect of geography is a bit beyond me, but yes, it's essentially this gorgeous stone landscape. These rocks, this beautiful, this very particular type of fauna and flora. That's just incredibly distinctive. And this quite small area of County Clare. Yeah, and there is a little ferry that then goes from Clare to North Kerry, which saves you having to do a big trawl around to Limerick. Although Limerick there are nice aspects to Limerick too. But yeah, it is just a beautiful landscape. And when I send people to Ireland, when our people come, when I send people, when people come to Ireland, and they want to go around like that area, to go from Clare through to Galway, is just so beautiful and so distinctive that if you want a kind of snapshot of Ireland, that is it. You know, a lot of people might go to Killarney, which is also very beautiful, but in a very, very different way. Killarney is almost too lush. It's too beautiful in a way, whereas there is a ruggedness to the west of Ireland. If you're driving through Connemara, in winter, it's an incredibly hostile landscape, you know, so you see it in summer and it's beautiful, but it's a difficult place. As it used to be said that to hell, that province is Connacht, our westernmost province. And the British used to say to hell or to Connacht, that was the choice the peasants were given. You can either go to Connacht, where you couldn't raise cattle, you could maybe raise some sheep, you couldn't really grow anything, or you could be killed, you could just die. That was the choice you were given. And that's why a lot of people, you know, a lot of the poorer, it's still regarded as, well, it was for a very long time, was regarded as really one of the poorest sections of Ireland, because really, like I said, it's quite difficult to grow things there. It is quite a difficult landscape in which to eke out a living. That has now obviously changed considerably, and it's now become more of a tourist destination. But, you know, for hundreds of years, people went there who weren't tourists.
Well, you're right. Killarney has a beautiful lake, and it's lush and green, and you know, you think of poetry and other things in Killarney. The Burren is so rocky; it's almost like a fortress or something. There is a cave, because one of the tourist attractions that I've been to in the Burren, although I didn't like it nearly as well as just driving over the regular landscape, is a whole cave thing you can do, you know.
Is it the Ailwee Cave, I think it's
Yes,
called?
exactly. Which, I mean, we have some remarkable caves here in the United States. So as a cave, I didn't think that it necessarily stacked up.
Caves.
But I really, really love the landscape of the Burren. And then you continue up. I mean, the west coast of Ireland is truly beautiful. But on our last visit, John, we hadn't spent really any time on the East Coast except in Dublin. The north part, of course, where the giant staircase is, which is that amazing geological formation, has become famous here in America because this is where the Game of Thrones was filmed. And so first couple of times I sailed around Ireland, nobody really did a lot about, you know, visiting the north. You went to Belfast and you made the pilgrimage to the giant staircase and ood and on, but that was kind of it. But now they run whole, you know, tour groups up to see where the filming is.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the problem was obviously that for so long, Northern Ireland was mired in the Troubles, and it wasn't really a place where people outside the province really thought of as a tourist destination, and people from the south even were quite cautious about visiting there. I remember when I was in college at the end of the 1980s, we missed the final train home because I think the train used to leave at 6 o'clock. I was up there with my first girlfriend, and her father insisted that we pay a driver to drive us down to the south, and then he picked us up halfway rather than spend the night in Belfast, because it was regarded as still a very risky place for people from the south. And thankfully then we had the peace agreement, and then obviously John Hume, one of the men most responsible for bringing peace to Northern Ireland, has just recently died. So we're very conscious of that history at the moment. But you know, since then Northern Ireland has been transformed, and people are incredibly kind there. It hasn't been spoiled by tourism, because really until recently, like I said, there wasn't really any tourism there. And so when you go there, I think you'll experience a very different, an older kind of Ireland. It's almost, I always feel like it's almost like going to somewhere from the 50s or 60s. You know, you still go up there and people will still call you love or darling when they're serving you your soup or your coffee. And it's got this extraordinary history, this very troubled history, but also this very, very beautiful history. And the money from Game of Thrones made a huge difference and put Northern Ireland on the tourist map in a way that it probably hadn't been before. And long may that continue.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with you. The first time I was in Belfast, I think we were all still nervous about potential violence. So, you know, you did your pilgrimage to the place where they built the Titanic.
Yeah.
You know, where there's now a fairly fancy museum, but at one point it was just like the dry dock, you know, where they put it together. And you didn't venture any place really up but but as I said again, to the giant staircase. But now there's that amazing bridge, you know, the one, there's a castle, there's the ruins of a castle. And then past that, there's this amazing kind of a swing, I mean, like a rope bridge or something, you know, that goes across, and only the brave really want to step out on it. And so seen all that. But last time we went up the entire West Coast. We were in the Scillies and went to Tresco Abbey, which I think is one of the most beautiful gardens I have ever been to. And then we wandered up the West Coast and visited several islands. And one of the places, I'm trying to remember the name of the city, maybe you will think of it, was really famous for doing carpets. They did hand knotted carpets. And no, this is in Ireland on the West Coast. I should have looked this up before we had this conversation, because now I'm just groping. But they made carpets so famous that they were in Buckingham Palace and all over. But now there are only like a handful of women who still know how to do these hand knotted carpets. Sure. It's basically dying, and they have a museum. And my husband and I really like doing, you know, offbeat kinds of fun stuff. So after we went for a hike out in the countryside, and then we sat on the wall of the port and had fish and chips, you know, from the fish and chip truck. We went over and visited this amazing carpet museum, and they gave us lessons and so forth. And I remember feeling really sad years and years ago when I was in Northern Wales. I sat on the castle walls, I think it was in Connolly, and had a couple-hour conversation with the mason whose job it was to try to keep the city and the castle, the walls intact. And his problem was that what he needed was to train up some young lads, some apprentices, you know, in this ancient craft, but nobody was especially interested in it.
Well, sure.
And I felt the same way about these, you know, elderly ladies who really wanted to pass on their skills. But it basically was a dying industry. I think it had been actually started by an entrepreneur from Scotland who had sailed over there and established the factory. And
we are conscious of, we've begun making a lot of gin and whiskey. I know we associate Ireland with whiskey for a long time, but actually whiskey production, small scale whiskey production, hasn't happened here for a very long time, because the English imposed huge tariffs on whiskey production for a very long time to protect the Scottish whiskey industry. And that essentially killed all these little distilleries. That's why when people go to Scotland, they're always amazed by the number of small distilleries that you can visit. But you couldn't really do the same thing in Ireland because a lot of that had been suppressed here. And so now, you know, you can't throw a stone without finding a small whiskey distillery or a small gin mill somewhere along the way, gin distillery. So maybe we are conscious of some of these things. And it would be nice to think that maybe somebody will spot the fact that this is a craft worth, it's distinctive, it's part of our heritage, and maybe that it's worth preserving.
Well, I hope so, but you have to engage the young in it. And I think that's increasingly harder. People are not willing to work that hard in that kind of technology for a fairly low wage, because it takes months to produce one of these carpets.
And the apprenticeship is so laborious and takes such a long time. You're probably right. Maybe there are some things that are just not going to survive.
The other really nice thing that we did the last time, as I said, we spent most of our time, thanks to you, in Western Ireland, you know, Ring of Kerry and, you know, the Abbey and Galway and Ashford Castle and all these great things. And I've done Northern, but I never really have done much south of Dublin. And the two times that we have been able to sail into, is it Cork I'm thinking about, whether they're on the south coast and on the east coast of Ireland. There are two ports there. Is Cork one of them?
Yes, well, this Cork is right down in the south, and then there's Rosslare, which is the port in Wexford that a lot of the ferries go into.
I wasn't thinking of the ferry. It's a cruise ship thing.
Oh, well, a lot of those would go into Cork Harbour, sure.
Right. So both times we have been frustrated by weather and unable to go there. So this last time, driving back from Ashford Castle, because it turned out that the flights from Shannon didn't go back to London at a time that we could catch our flight back to the United States. So we rented a car in Dublin. We drove all the way across the motorway to Ashford Castle. We spent our few days in Ashford Castle, and we drove all the way back to Dublin. And I thought that we should see it. So we went down and spent a couple of nights at Powers Court, which has the most gorgeous gardens. I'm bringing this up because I'm not sure Americans think about Ireland having stately homes in the same sense that some of the great British houses with their gardens. But Powers Court, in point of fact, really does have an extraordinary garden, although I'm not sure that the owners of it weren't in fact the British aristocracy in Ireland.
Oh, they would have. Any of those big houses would have been owned by either absentee English landlords or Anglo-Irish people who had sufficient money to build them and maintain them. Now a lot of them are hotels. Powers Court, I think Powers Court is a hotel. That's just the way it's gone. But yeah, there is if you drive out of Dublin an hour out of Dublin, you get to Glendalough, which is our beautiful old monastic city. There are these extraordinary sites. To some degree, when you're Irish, you kind of take a lot of them for granted in a way, because we have so many castles, we have so many beautiful ruins that to some degree, you almost stop noticing the fact that they're there. And it's only really when somebody's coming over to visit that I think of them in that way and think, well, actually, yes, you should go and see the Rock of Cashel. You should go to see Glendalough. You should visit Powers Court. You should take these opportunities to see these things, because in some ways they're probably not quite as touristed and managed as they are in other countries. There is a little bit more of a laissez-faire attitude to them, and that's no bad thing, really.
There is a laissez-faire attitude, and I should give a shout out to Cashel, because Peter Tremaine, who is, Lord, he must be coming up on nearly 30 mysteries featuring Sister Fidelma, who's again a medieval, really early medieval Irish nun and sleuth. But Cashel is kind of, all the little kingdoms is one of the places where that is featured. So I have indeed been to Cashel, which is this massive rock, right, with a castle on top of it.
Yeah, I think it was the Archbishop's fortress, I think, at one point.
Yes, clearly. So Peter has a new book out called The Shapeshifter's Lair. He's a lovely man. His real name is Peter Ellis, I think. And he's quite a noted historian and so forth of Ireland. But as Peter Tremaine, he writes Irish mysteries. So, who else can we talk about just for a second?
But I think what you raised there is that it is interesting that writers from outside are often more interested in exploring Irish heritage in that way than Irish authors are. It's often been British authors, American authors in particular, who've been writing these kinds of historical mysteries set in Ireland. Because one of the issues that we've had is for pretty much a large part of the 20th century, you don't get a great deal of Irish crime fiction being written. There is some of it being written, but it doesn't grab people in quite the way that British crime fiction grabs people or American crime fiction at the same period does. And really, Irish crime fiction has only really enjoyed a renaissance in the first 2 decades of this century. Mm-hmm. And now we're seeing a model of Irish crime fiction emerge, which is quite distinctive in its way. What I find interesting about the Irish crime fiction that's been written at the moment by Irish authors is that it's predominantly female. I can think of really very few male mystery authors from that early period who've survived commercially up to the present day. It has been dominated by writers like Jane Casey, Andrea Carter, Liz Nugent. We really have embraced a female-driven model of mystery fiction. And it may be because in Ireland, most fiction is written by women. Most fiction is bought by women. And to some degree, that loyalty or that female readership transferred quite easily to mystery fiction. And also, I think early on, a lot of male Irish writers, they became interested in gangland or using mystery fiction to explore gang issues or politics. And I sometimes find that, I think people don't mind reading about gangs in newspapers, but don't necessarily want to read about it in their fiction. And politics tends to date crime fiction very, very quickly. The more crime fiction tries to be contemporary, the more quickly I think it gets left behind. And sometimes it works better dealing with more general topics, dealing with psychology, dealing with the psychology of crime, the criminal and the investigator, I suppose. And I think the female writers cottoned onto that very, very quickly. And so they have produced, they've become very, very successful. And it may be now that we're going to have an entirely female-driven crime fiction body in Ireland for the foreseeable future. And they're fantastic writers. I feel a little bit sorry for some of the male writers who've been left behind, but it's almost the exact opposite in Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland, it's still very male-driven with a handful of female writers. You know, I'm thinking of somebody like Brian McGilloway or Stuart Neville would probably be the names best known to your readers. So yeah, but it is interesting now to see what form Irish crime fiction is going to take. And like I said, it does seem to be that it is in the South, at least, it is concentrated around female writers and female readers.
That's a really interesting insight. I did like Liz Nugent's first book very much. And of course, I do know Stuart Neville. Adrian McKinney wrote some books set in Belfast.
I should have mentioned Adrian, of course, he's fantastic.
Yeah, before he's gone off in a different track with the chain. And we've already talked about Benjamin Black. I like Brian McGilloway a lot. We bring his books in because they're not published here in the States. Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting point. I think crime fiction always evolves, and there are trends. And right now, there's a very heavy female-driven psychological, family, domestic, trend that's gone on really ever since Gone Girl and The Girl on the Train. But all of these things after a while become so overweighted that something new emerges. I remember in the 1990s, male authors laying their heads on my shoulder and weeping because the whole Sisters in Crime thing, everybody wanted to write female private eye, and New York was spurning, all the male authors. And then it changes. So, right now it may be, as you say, but it'll probably change again.
Well, yeah, and I think one of the other issues is how will Black Lives Matter affect how we depict policemen in novels? How we depict the actions of the police? Because now that kind of unconditional trust you might have had in the idea of the police figure working in the interests of law and justice may actually be quite difficult to sustain in this current environment. And it would be interesting to see writers, how they will address that, how that's going to feed into their books. Not to say that writers haven't been trying to address it, writers have addressed issues of corruption and racism, but I think those things are going to become much more pronounced over the next year or two. And I'm very interested to see how American writers in particular choose to tackle that.
Well, I think you're right. But as I said to David Baldacci, whose first book, Absolute Power, postulated a president as a serial rapist and murderer, was the first time that anybody wanted to look hard at, a figure like that. There, in many crime novels right now, the cops are the bad guys, either the villains, either they're corrupt or they're actually bad actors, or they're covering up murder, or often they're covering up domestic abuse because they have sort of a shield, for domestic abuse that can be quite powerful. So,
yeah. I mean, I think, but isn't that's almost like it's almost going almost too far in the other direction, that what you hope you're going to get is a kind of more nuanced view of the relations between police and particularly with Black and minority communities. Because I think, I mean, you can write a novel, I'm just thinking something like Don Winslow's The Force, where you just portray this group of policemen as completely out of control. And actually then it becomes quite difficult to sustain. It becomes almost like an act of fantasy. So I'm even as I'm writing at the moment, I have these kind of issues at the back of my mind and thinking, well, how do they affect me? How do they arise in the context of my own work, and what obligations do I have? And it's curious, when I was writing The Dirty South, one of the difficulties is that it's essentially a historical novel. It's set in Arkansas at the end of the 1990s. And so it's a situation where actually you don't have a great many Black policemen in positions of authority. You don't even have very many female police officers in positions of authority. I remember looking up news reports, and it was still quite, like, astonishing when a department had women in it. It was like, look, a woman, she can probably do math as well. It was, and so when you're writing a book like that, you have on one level, a duty to portray the times as they were, but also you have a duty to kind of interrogate that at the same time. And that's a difficult balancing act to pull off. How do you depict a society which is essentially balanced overwhelmingly in favor of white males, and yet give an entry point for readers who are not white males, who might not have any particular sympathy towards them, and recognize that a different struggle was going on in the background then, and is continuing to go on now?
Well, we're actually trying to work that out in real life as well as in
Sure.
film. So, yeah, it's an interesting question. Again, I can't remember the name of the author, but there was an Irish author who set several very good novels in Dublin and introduced at least 2 or 3 times the African population in Dublin, particularly, I'm trying to remember, from maybe Nigeria. There's some African country, a number of fairly militant religious figures who had come to Ireland. And so, it's easy to think of Ireland as being like a homogenous white, Celtic population, but like every other country, you've had plenty of immigrants, and, not everybody looks alike. I did remember finally the name of the carpet town. It's called Killybegs.
Oh, okay, very good. All right, you know things about it that I don't, so I've learned something from you.
Well, this proves my theory about aging and memory. It isn't actually that you forget anything. It's just that the retrieval system has seriously slowed down. So yes, for 10 minutes, there's been a little sort of whir thing going on in my head in the background going, all right, what was the name of the carpet?
You haven't lost your keys, just forgotten where you left them. That's all it is.
I love it, because if I really lost my memory, I couldn't recall it. And I find constant proof of it, which is wonderful. Well, I am looking forward to talking to you specifically about the Dirty South in October, and about Charlie Parker and why you choose to write, an American-based crime figure, and all kinds of interesting things about Charlie, his supernatural elements and backup crew, Chapel of Bones. I wanted to tell you, and I can't remember, here I go again, where it was, but I actually someplace in the last 2 or 3 years went to visit a place specifically because it had a Chapel of Bones. So that was my tip of the hat to you.
Oh, well, I'm very glad that I'm expanding your horizons into bone chapels, and it's sure we'll be adding mausoleums, Lord knows what else. We'll be adding to your list of must-see places as we go along.
I think I have a photo of it. Maybe I'll find it and we'll look at it during because we can put photos up on Zoom while we are talking. But John, one of the real joys about reading crime fiction, it's not just the stories and the characters and the amazing landscapes, which can be so distinctive and all, but you always get to learn great stuff, because crime writers are particularly good, I think, at if not research drawing upon actual life experiences or the newspapers or whatever, but you get to learn things in a much more entertaining fashion than if you're doing just nonfiction. Although narrative nonfiction, turning fiction, nonfiction, depicting it in story form. I'm doing an event next week with Ariel Sebar, who has written this fascinating book about a Harvard professor who fell victim to an amazing religious con. And the Wall Street Journal wrote it up the other day and presented it as a 5-act drama. Then basically Sebar, I'm not sure if he pronounces it Sabar or Sebar, I'll have to ask him, really constructed, use a novel structure in order to tell this story of deeply granular level investigative journalism. And I think that's a form that we're seeing a lot more of, where, people are bringing the skills of a novelist to actual events, to true crime or to history.
But the very, very good Irish writer, very notable Irish writer, resenting at one point being called a storyteller. He said he didn't want to be thought of as a storyteller, which I always thought for somebody who wrote fiction seemed to be missing the point slightly. It seemed like if you were a carpenter and didn't want to be called a woodsman or a woodworker. But I always think that we naturally tell stories. We're storytellers, and no matter what book you write, whether it's a work of nonfiction dealing with science or history, geography, whatever, everything begins with, what am I trying to tell here? What am I trying to tell the reader here? What story is here? What narrative is here? And so I think I love seeing the tools of narrative fiction being drawn into nonfiction. I love to see it being reinvented and reworked in that way, because I think it's actually intrinsic to the way that we view the world. I think storytelling is incredibly important for us, and I don't think it really matters what facet you're in. If you're trying to explain something to people, you are in fact telling them a story. You just have to figure out what the story is.
I couldn't agree with you more. And in the extraordinary time that we are living, where honestly no fiction writer could make up any of the stuff currently going on. I mean, it's like we're living in a novel written by Stephen King. I do think that narrative nonfiction may be one way to explore it. And you yourself have also written some wonderful books about Irish legend, Irish fairy tales, books for younger readers. So, you're a very versatile writer. You like all sorts of storytelling, which is one of the really, fun things about your whole career. I've really enjoyed watching you explore different kinds of storytelling. It's been great. So we could also talk about how we first met in Manchester when you acted Sir Walter Raleigh and saved Joanne Harris and myself. All those years ago, which I think is the first time we met. So that's a story for another day. Thank you for your time, John.
Robert, as always, thank you for your time and support, and look after yourself. Stay happy and well, and I will see you soon.
And you too, October 19th. We'll look forward to it. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.